You are now deep in the mountains of Tibet, the highest part of the Earth's surface. That snow-capped peak above you is Karakal, and below, in the valley of the Blue Moon, lies the lamasery of Shangri-La.
It was a strange and incredible sight. A group of colored pavilions clinging to the mountainside like flower petals impaled upon a crag. Overhead, a dazzling pyramid of snow, beautiful, terrifying. From the cliffs on which we stood to the serene peace and quiet of Shangri-La was like a descent into another world. I came to this world across the mountains from India. There was little we could do for him, and as the early rays of the sun caught the summit of the mountain, the man died. They were men, a party of a dozen or more, crawling like ants across the white face of the cliff. And as they drew near, we saw they carried a hooded chair, and in it a heavily robed figure, an elderly Chinese. I never exactly remembered how we arrived at the lamasery. The thin air had a dreamlike texture, and I was half conscious of a strange sensation, half mystical, half visual, of having reached at least some place that was an end, a finality. Shangri-La, I learned, was a sort of monastery. Those in full lamahood numbered about 50, and their prevalent belief was in moderation, the virtue of avoiding excess of all kinds. These things I learned the first night as I stood with Chang on the broad balcony overlooking the valley. In the days that followed at Shangri-La, I gave myself over to a rich and growing enchantment. In the petal-colored buildings which dotted the mountain, I recognized priceless treasures of art. In the spacious library, I discovered the great literature of the present and of the centuries past. One morning, I stood beside a lotus pool in an open pavilion of the lamasery. In an archway behind me, a young girl was seated at a piano, a girl in Chinese dress. She was like a delicately painted miniature.
Good morning.
What? Oh, good morning, Chang.
You are pleased with Lotsen?
Yes, she plays beautifully.
She has studied for a great many years.
What? How could she? How old is Lotsen?
I'm afraid I cannot tell you.
One night, the moonlight fell on Shangri-La, bathing the pavilion in a sea of blue. I followed Chang through the lamasery up a spiral staircase to a door which opened noiselessly before us. Chang left silently. As I became accustomed to the gloom, I saw sitting before me a small and wrinkled man, his face thin and drawn tight over the frame of his skull. And his eyes, I felt dizzy beneath the gaze of those ancient eyes.
And the fourth was not far from death, when, by accident, he stumbled into the rocky defile that remains today the only practical approach to our valley of the Blue Moon. And there, to his joy and surprise, he found a friendly population who bade him welcome. For more than half a century, Father Perrault labored with his hands, tilling his own garden, and learning from the inhabitants as well as teaching them. Then, in the year 1789, news descended to the valley that Father Perrault was dying at last. He lay for many weeks without speech or movement, and then he began to recover. He was then 108.
The ancient Lama paused. What he had told me held me speechless with wonder. It was 14 years later, he told me, that a wanderer found his way to Father Perrault's monastery, an Austrian named Henschel. A great friendship sprang up between the two, and Henschel stayed on. It was then that they had a wild, fantastic dream. Art treasures from Europe and Asia were purchased for the valley's gold and stored at Shangri-La. The library was filled with the great works of the world, and later it was decided to admit travelers and strangers who had lost their way. The High Lama who sat beside me had lived for nearly 2.5 centuries. My coming was no accident. Many lamas had died, and the pilot had been sent out into the world to find new persons to take their place. One night at midnight, I was summoned to the presence of the High Lama.
My son, there is a great storm gathering in the world, a black fury which will not spend itself for many years. It may rage till every flower of culture is trampled, and all human things are leveled in vast chaos. But I believe that you will live through the storm, and I see a new world stirring in the ruins, seeking its lost and legendary treasures. And they will all be here, my son, hidden behind the mountains in the valley of the blue moon. My son.
The High Lama stopped speaking. The glow in his eyes faded. And presently it came to me as in a dream. The High Lama was dead. I tried then to tell him the secret of Shangri-La. He looked at me as though I were mad. And as I read the disbelief in his eyes, I began to doubt myself. And then Lotson came to me. For hours, I paced the balcony, and before me were the wistful, pleading eyes of the little Manchu girl. That morning, with the wind roaring through the jagged cliffs, we made the ascent from Shangri-La. For weeks we traveled toward the east, Mallinson, the girl, and I. And then the porters began to desert. One by one they disappeared. And then there were just the three of us. And for a long while there were only two. Mallinson had died. And at first I tried to believe it was the hardship of the journey which had changed Lotson. They found us on the road to Chungkyang, and we were taken to the hospital there. Lotson died that same night. The oldest woman they'd ever seen. The storm of which Father Perrault warned me still rages. Not yet has the Christian ethic been fulfilled, when the meek shall inherit the earth. Shangri-La has a heritage to cherish and bequeath, with such wisdom as men will need when their passions are spent. Soon I hope I will return. Somewhere beyond Lhasa, on the high roof of the world, I seem to picture a long plateau running north, and far away, a mountain rising white against the sky. I hope I find it again, for this, I think, is Caracal. And beyond is Shangri-La and the Valley of the Blue Moon.
Special music was composed by Jerry Goldsmith.